I am now over 100 hours into a full playthrough of the Chronicles of Myrtana, Archolos, after having previously only played 20 hours or less across the first chapter and change back at the start of 2022. I'm still early in Chapter 4, at the part where the main quest sends you to talk to the Wolf's Den, so it would seem that there's still plenty of game left to experience, but I wanted to take a moment to revisit my original impressions from a few years ago and reflect on how some of those thoughts have changed or evolved with this replay, now that I've experienced some things for a second time and have been getting more overall exposure to the full game. Normally I probably wouldn't bother with this, but since it'll be a while longer before I even finish playing the game, let alone write and edit a review, I figured this would be a fun thing to do in the meantime as a way to catalog my journey through the game as these thoughts develop. Bear in mind that these are still just impressions, seeing as I still haven't completed the game, so it's possible that I could be wrong about some of these things, and some of this may still change later on when I get around to doing my final thoughts review. So as before, take all of this with a grain of salt. I will keep spoilers limited so as not to discuss anything concrete that happens beyond Chapter 1 as I did originally, and I'd ask that everyone please be mindful of that as well for myself and anyone else reading the comments who has yet to finish the game. Now, a lot of my thoughts from back then are still pretty much the same, so in the interest of brevity, I don't want to go through every single point to just summarizing what I've already said and then going, yeah, that's still the case for me. So instead, I'll just be focusing on the specific topics where I feel there's been some notable change or that I feel deserve more elaboration than I gave originally. If you have not watched my original impressions, I would say that you don't need to watch them first since this will be the more updated version of certain things, but afterward you can then go back to check some of the other topics that I didn't cover in this one if you would like to know more about what I thought originally. So the first point I want to bring up is lots of dialogue choices with branching paths. This is a positive point that has grown on me over time, as it really does seem like there's a lot of great reactivity to your choices that can impact the way other people react to you or how entire quest lines can play out. I have not been meticulously checking every single option to see what all of the branching outcomes are for every situation, but I've still run into a lot of instances where a different choice will in fact send a quest into a different scenario altogether that completely changes the resolution of the quest line, with lots of recurring plot developments to indicate some degree of lasting consequences for these choices. Sometimes that means you find a certain NPC in an unexpected area and they have new dialogue to reflect their change of situation, or that calls back to a decision you made much earlier, or else other times someone might mysteriously turn up dead as a result of your actions long after you thought the quest was successfully done and over with. Quests are also apt to reference your guild and thus frame the context of why you're getting involved in these quests in a different light. Plenty of other smaller choices that also don't seem like they're going to be important can likewise lead to different responses that can then affect later prompts in the conversation, so it's actually happening a lot even when you might not realize it. Next is the combination of scripted and random events. Again, this is something I enjoyed early on, but I now really appreciate how much liveliness these features inject into the simple act of traversing the world. The original games can sometimes run into problems where you would complete all available content in an area and then spend a bunch of time running across the map with nothing to see or do along the way, which can be a little boring after a while, and so the random events do a great job of ensuring there will almost always be something new happening in familiar areas. That includes seemingly spawning new enemies in cleared areas within a single chapter, so even the roads might not be totally safe at all times. There's a lot of creativity on display here too, with such a wide range of events that are serious, wacky, frivolous, dire, and what have you, so they're always fun to run into and see just what new encounter is going to happen. This is one of the best new features in Archolos that I absolutely love, and wish could have been in the original games, at least in some capacity. For strong world building and characterization, this is yet another one that's grown on me significantly. I haven't seen as much of certain characters as I would like, but there have been a few who I've been glad to see in recurring roles with new quests in later chapters. The world building is what I really want to touch on here, though, because this might be the most compelling aspect of Archolos' story so far, for me at least, just in terms of learning about how this island came to be, how it operates currently, what situations might be in store for its future, and so on. There's a surprising amount of lore behind each different location on the island, even with different districts within the city itself, which is utterly impressive with how organic it feels, like this was a real place built in progressive stages for different purposes based on the landscape around it and the needs of the society at the time. It actually makes the environments of Gothic 2 feel quaint in comparison, while still not being excessively convoluted or overbearing. And I'm really impressed with how much the situation on the island is actually changing from one chapter to the next, with new NPCs and enemies showing up to make it feel like the stakes are actually rising as the game goes by. Regarding good density of content in Silbach, this one is still true, but it didn't strike me as hard on replay, presumably due to being already familiar with everything and remembering where to go or how to do certain things. That's not a knock on Silbach or the game itself, of course, since I still really like the area and believe that it does have good density of content, but it's just interesting to note that my perception did change a little on this one. And of course, it too feels incredibly quaint after having explored the entire city and done a bunch of quests there, so it's even more interesting how something that was once impressively noteworthy to me was quickly surpassed by later areas of the game. Continuing on, we have the map is an ideal blend of direction, focus, and openness. With this, I was talking about how the map design provides great opportunities for free roaming exploration in any direction you like, while still having a lot of structure to help break the world into more manageable chunks that feel more like deliberate level design features to be conquered, as opposed to just pointless space to spread the major locations out. I still feel that way, of course, but I feel more confident in saying now that I think I actually enjoy the exploration more in this game than the original Gothics just because of the new map design. It feels richly complex and detailed, with even more notable verticality to make everything more engaging this time around, which is a point I make in a later topic. The one major thing I want to add to this section is that the map might even be a little too open in not restricting certain main quest areas a little more. In my case, I feel like I spoiled at least one pretty big reveal and undermined some exciting quest opportunities by having already thoroughly explored one particular area of the map before the main quest sent me there in Chapter 3. So I wish I had known in advance to just not go there at all, or that the area could have been closed off a little more so that I couldn't have just wandered in there at any time and basically spoiled what could have been an interesting part of the main quest. There's another area that seems like it's intended for a late-game quest event, which is at least partially closed off, whose impact I'm hoping will not be similarly spoiled by me having already wandered in there early. Next up is good atmosphere in some new-ish environments. I still like the atmosphere in all places of the map, and feel like there's a good variety of environments to explore here, which also feel coherently plausible as all being part of this one relatively small island. But I haven't really found any new environments that feel truly new and different yet. So far, everything seems to be variations on existing themes that we've already seen from Gothic 2, just with a slight twist on things, hence my prior use of the term new-ish. The vineyards in the valley around the Wolf's Den are maybe the most distinct areas that I've seen thus far, but otherwise there still hasn't been anything that's really blown me away like the environments we saw in Night of the Raven, or even some of the dragon layers from the base game. So I'm still holding out hope that some of these restricted areas will kindle more of that excitement for new areas, which has been largely teased but not fully satisfied. It would be really cool to get inside the volcano, for instance, but I'm not sure if that's a possibility, so this may just be wishful thinking. For new variations on existing enemy types, I'm even more impressed by how much extra variety has been added to the experience with all the new enemies. I've seen a lot more new enemies by now than I did on my first go-around, so the variety is actually way more than I originally imagined. It would seem as though every new enemy is built off of some existing creature, but some of them are different enough to look like entirely new enemies, while many of the existing enemies have new versions with new animations, and even some of the same old enemies have had their behaviors changed to mix up the strategy necessary to fight them. This ties back into the point I made earlier about seamlessly adding new depth on top of existing mechanics, which I find to be a commendable way to go about expanding on the gameplay without having to completely reinvent the wheel. It does seem like there have been a lot of just straight up reskins with higher stats, however, which is good for matching the thematic aesthetics of each area, like with having alligators in the sewers or swamp lizards in the swamps instead of just regular lizards, and is probably necessary to fill in some of the gaps in the progression system. But it does feel a little artificial in some instances when later chapters are just spawning more difficult variations of the same creatures in the same places for seemingly no other reason than the player being higher level, therefore there must be higher level enemies here to compensate. So that's just a weird observation that I'm not completely sold on. Regarding not much of a compelling story hook, this has apparently been my most controversial take from my original impressions, because it would seem that a lot of people find the story hook of Archolos far more compelling than I did. Now, to be fair, I do enjoy the early stages of Chapter 1, with first trying to survive the marooning and then integrating your band of refugees within society around Silbach, just because of how strong the actual gameplay scenarios and characterization are. But once the main quest turns into babysitting Yorn and finding multiple cures for him, and then having to search for him when he goes missing, I start checking out of it because I just do not feel a strong enough connection to him and find that whole prospect actively unappealing, which makes it difficult for me to care about pursuing the main quest at all. My points about not having this issue with Gothic 1 or 2 was not to say that those games have better stories, or that I demand to play as the chosen hero or whatever, or that just being a regular guy trying to start a new life on a new island can't be compelling on its own, but rather that I felt more of a compelling drive to advance the main quest early on in those games because it felt like they got to the heart of the matter a lot quicker. Like, I'm 100 hours into Archolos right now at the start of Chapter 4, and it feels like it's been all exposition with no actual story yet. Maybe it gets interesting eventually, and all this run around searching for Yorn will actually pay off, but I'm sorry, I just do not find the story compelling to this point. Continuing on, we have some annoyingly linear quest scripting. While this has still not become a widespread, prevalent issue or anything, I have started to notice a fair number of quests and events where you're seemingly forced to do something in a particular way with no opportunity to try realistic alternatives. Sometimes this means dying in a cutscene without any control of your character to defend yourself because they don't want you to skip ahead in the quest line, or non-interactive doors conveniently opening or closing at certain moments to control when you have access to very specific locations, or the game literally teleporting you back into an area if you wander too far away, or quests forcing a particular outcome on you when it would seem like there should be a reasonable alternative, or Marvin just straight up refusing to kill certain people. All to make you play along with the script and do the quest as it was intended to be done. I don't necessarily mind linear quests that have to be done a certain way, but it can be frustrating sometimes with how the logic gets applied in this game and how arbitrarily restrictive some of these scenarios can be. Next up is, some of the new sound effects and audio are bad. I was fairly positive towards the new sound effects overall, but did find a few that I didn't like as much, as well as a few instances where the sound mix felt completely wrong to me. I'm pleased to note that these particular issues haven't bothered me in my replay. The ambient sounds in the woodcutter's camp, for instance, seem to have been dialed in better since I made these comments, so they blend better with the environment, and for whatever reason I didn't feel as weirded out by those awkward crab noises this time around. One thing I have noticed, however, is a few areas around the charcoal burner's camp and the beach behind Burmer's farm, where the wave sounds from the water become overbearingly loud and lose all directional focus, as if something just went wrong in the code and they never got fixed. It's not a big deal, of course, but it's been a consistent problem for me in those areas that I hope can be fixed without too much effort in upcoming versions. For cooking is a little tedious, this is another one that a lot of people seem to disagree with, which is fine, but I still absolutely feel this way. So to clarify here, I like the idea behind cooking and the extra possibilities that it unlocks for the sake of gameplay and even immersion, but the interface system behind it seems much more convoluted and fiddly than it probably should be, with scrolling through unsorted lists to find what I need while flipping between different windows and submenus to see important information, while trying to compare and contrast all this information across so many different sources. Even just trying to grill up specific quantities of meat kicks you out of that specific sub-menu every time, so you have to repeat the entire process just to reselect the same option a second time. And it's hard to tell at a passing glance which ingredients are currently active in your any sub-menu because they all have similar looking text next to them, when they could have just omitted the ingredient not used text and only indicated which are actually being used for the sake of easier visual clarity. That's the kind of stuff that makes the cooking so tedious to me. Not so much the cooking itself, but the whole process of interacting with the interface. Admittedly, this is mainly an issue in the early stages of the game when you're still gaining lots of new recipes to compare and have to be more selective about how you spend your limited resources, so it becomes less of an issue later on once you figure out what specific recipes are worth focusing on, and as you accumulate a large enough stockpile of ingredients that you don't have to fiddle around with the interface so much to accomplish what you need. And at least as of right now, it seems like the cooking has actually become almost obsolete because the recipes now heal for so little health compared to my max that I much prefer to craft healing potions whenever possible, which heal by percentage. So at this point, the cooking doesn't really bother me anymore, but that's mainly because I'm just not having to fiddle with it so much. Continuing on, we have some odd translation hiccups. At the time, I thought the translations were really good, but with just minor words or phrases that didn't always feel the most natural in English. I, for instance, was a little confused when characters repeatedly insisted on having a barber make some medicine for Yorn, which is really my fault for not knowing or remembering the historical context of the barber profession as essentially a medical doctor in these times. But they have since updated all uses of the term barber to now read as the official title barber surgeon, which I appreciate for the extra clarity. However, I've since run into a dozen or so more egregious instances where the entire meaning of something has apparently been lost in translation, leaving me utterly confused when my character does something differently than what the dialogue prompt was indicating, or when the subtitles say the exact opposite of what actually ends up happening. I've even seen a few lines that are just straight up incomplete sentence fragments. At one point, I did an entire quest wrong because I thought something was being not so subtly implied in like a wink wink nudge nudge kind of way, and was then harshly reprimanded when I thought I was doing exactly what the quest giver wanted, because I'm not sure the translation was getting the message or tone across correctly. This one is obviously a nitpick considering that the translations are perfectly fine most of the time and usually easy to understand even when things are phrased a little awkwardly, but it turns out there are actually some serious errors that I would say are worth fixing in future revisions. Next up is a more direct approach to the storytelling. This one was mainly talking about the heavily scripted intro scenario that comprises the bulk of Chapter 1, which is a much stronger emphasis on cutscenes and dramatic storytelling than we're used to seeing in the Gothic games, while even giving the main character an established yet not fully revealed background from the very beginning. At this point, 100 hours later, I feel like the storytelling has actually shifted to a more indirect approach, seeing as the story seems to be more about setting up a bunch of other, seemingly unrelated things happening on the island that I presume are going to form the main story once some catalyzing event happens, but which thus far haven't really contributed to any real overarching plot. So it's a little weird to me that the storytelling has seemingly shifted this much, considering that Chapter 1 made it seem like the story was going to be much more overt, only for it to now feel largely obfuscated throughout Chapters 2 and 3 and the very start of Chapter 4. I'm hoping that this is all just part of assembling a puzzle, and that eventually some key piece will fall into place, but it's still been a bit of a jarring shift considering what I thought Chapter 1 was setting up. Finally, we have the soundtrack is a mix of good and questionable. I was very complimentary towards the soundtrack overall, but at the time I felt like a couple of the remixes didn't go together as well as some of the others and wasn't completely sold on every aspect of it. I think in general I may have been a little more critical of the music than was warranted because a lot of it is somewhat derivative with reusing so many existing melodies to represent a supposedly new environment instead of just doing its own original thing. Like, I'm not conceptually fond of hearing the old camp music in Silbach or the Corinus Harbor music in Archolos because I associate those songs very specifically with those original environments and thus they feel a little out of place to me in Archolos. But after 100 hours, any concerns I might have once had have gone away as I've gotten more used to it. I think by now, all the familiar parts may actually be a positive attribute in the soundtrack's favor by lending it that extra degree of authenticity to the originals, but while still technically being brand new since they're all new arrangements and recordings. In that way, it does a good job of stimulating one's nostalgia for the original games, but while putting enough new stuff underneath it for it to stand on its own legs as a sort of fresh new listening experience. All of the completely new, original music is extremely effective and fits with the style of the old music, so it's pretty impressive all around. My only real criticism at this point is that it tends to have a lot of high dynamic range, even within individual tracks, which makes balancing the audio levels a little more difficult, especially since speech and sound effects are lumped into the same track. But otherwise, the music is great. So that's it for my updates to my original impressions. For any topics in my first impressions that I didn't cover here, my thoughts are still basically the same, so no need to rehash those all over again. If you want, you can go back and watch that other video for those other subjects. But of course, I will almost certainly have more developing thoughts as I continue playing, some of which will likely be brand new subjects not previously covered in either of these impressions pieces, and some of these things may be repeated in some fashion in my final review if I feel they're relevant to the main points I want to cover, while other things may change as I gain new context on the full game experience. But that at least gives you an idea of where I'm at in the game right now and how things are shaping up thus far. It's obviously an extremely well-made mod that deserves all the praise it's received, and I've really enjoyed it overall to this point. It's been a real nostalgia treat that is surprisingly the best Piranha Bytes-like game to come out since Gothic 2, with many notable improvements on those original games. I still have 3 more chapters to go, however, so it remains to be seen if the rest of the game will hold up as strongly as the first 3 chapters, with the main quest and final resolution being one giant question mark at this point. Not to mention things like the final difficulty balancing and overall impact of the progression system. So I'm eager to continue onward and see how the rest of the game shapes up. With that, I thank you for watching and encourage you to stay tuned for my final thoughts once I've actually finished the game in proper.